This video will introduce you to using secondary sources for your legal research projects. In this video, we'll cover legal encyclopedias, American Law Reports or ALR, treatises, and CLE or continuing legal education materials. Let's get started. How would a practitioner start his or her research? Remember that a practitioner needs effective and efficient research. So rather than survey all available primary law on the topic, very time-consuming, that practitioner would begin with a secondary source. And that's the tip that we're going to enforce with you today. So think about secondary sources, and by that we mean treatises, practice guides, CLE materials, and so on, as your avuncular advisor, that older and wiser, experienced voice that's going to guide you in your research and get you started. So today we'll cover when to use secondary sources, what they are, what different types are available, and some tips to locate key secondary sources. So we talked about using secondary sources to be efficient and effective. The other reasons to use them is that they are easier to read and understand than the text of cases or statutes, particularly if you are new to a certain area of law. So a secondary source is written in plain narrative style, unlike the text of a statute or a regulation, which is going to be highly technical. The purpose of a secondary source is to discuss, explain, and analyze applicable primary law, so it's already going to get you a head start. It will also give you extensive citations to other related primary or secondary sources. Because secondary sources will contain background information such as the history of a particular field of practice, as well as current developments for a legal issue, it's going to be a great starting point for you. Also, these sources, since they're used by practitioners, are frequently updated, so you'll know you're getting current content. Let's review for a minute. We've been talking in the last few slides about primary versus secondary sources of law, so let's make sure we're really on the same page about that. When we talk about primary law, it's really the law, namely the statement of law in terms of a case, a statute, or a regulation, and that is coming from a governmental entity. So remember, the government issues our sources of law. It could be a court, a legislature, an executive agency, and so on. Generally, primary law can be either binding or persuasive. This can be very complicated because in your jurisdiction, your own legislature statutes are controlling. If you're in another jurisdiction, they are not going to be binding or controlling. They would only be persuasive. However, there are some tips that you would need to know about in terms of conflicts of law, etc. So we're not going to go into a lot of detail about that now. Let's think about secondary sources as contrasted to primary. Secondary sources are never the law. They're sources written about the law, and they come from legal commentators and scholars, so professors or practitioners and so on. These sources will discuss, explain, and analyze primary law, and secondary sources, no matter how scholarly or well-respected, can only ever be persuasive. They're never binding on anyone. So let's think about binding, mandatory versus persuasive now. So when we say binding or mandatory, we're saying that law has to be followed unless it's overruled, reversed, repealed, found to be unconstitutional, etc. And if we're talking about persuasive sources of law, they're used only to convince, and our secondary sources would fall into that category. And we mentioned that sometimes primary law may be considered persuasive if it's law from outside of your controlling jurisdiction. So we're going to focus on secondary sources and their helpfulness, even though they are still a persuasive force of law. So when we're looking at these secondary sources, we're going to find various types of primary law materials cited in them. In terms of the organic documents that create governmental power, we're going to see constitutions discussed on either the federal or state level. And if we're talking about municipal law and local governments, we're talking about the charter that would establish that governmental body. In legislatures, secondary sources will discuss statutes on either the federal or state level. If there's applicable municipal law, it may reference various ordinances or bylaws from towns. In terms of judiciary issuing law, we're talking about case law. So again, secondary sources will reference case law for you. Executive branch will issue regulations. We may think about regulations from the EPA, for example, on the federal level. There may be also regulations dealing with environmental hazards from New Jersey, for example, from their state level. In addition, the president can issue executive orders that have the force of law, and on a state level, a governor can issue an executive order with the force of law. So we're reviewing this only because we want to make sure that you understand that we use secondary sources as a means to discover and understand the applicable primary law. So rather than going instance by instance and searching for each of these categories in primary law, we'll use secondary source to aggregate those facts and pull them out for us and help explain them. So what types of secondary sources are there? We mentioned treatises, practice guides, continuing legal education materials used by members of the bar, legal encyclopedias, American law reports, restatements of the law, legal periodicals, even law journals, all law reviews, and even a blog could be considered a secondary source. So in this particular video, we're going to stop after American law reports, and we'll cover restatements and legal periodicals in the next video. So we're going to think about secondary sources as the time to jumpstart your research project. We want to jump in, gain a quick understanding of the structure and substance of a particular area of law. We're going to use that secondary source to increase awareness of emerging issues or new areas of law. And we can even use secondary sources to fine-tune a search in databases. So a quick way to learn the basic terminology and doctrines in an area of law, particularly if it's new to you. Where are these sources coming from? There are some major publishers. One is Thomson Reuters, same producer of Westlaw, Reed Elsevier, the LexisNexis and Matthew Bender publications, Wolters Kluwer, which covers Aspen and CCH, our Commerce Clearinghouse, and the Bureau of National Affairs, sometimes called BNA, now under the umbrella of Bloomberg BNA. There are others as well. Hein Online, for example, publishes many secondary sources. The American Bar Association, state and local bar associations, and any CLE or continuing legal education group, and sometimes law schools, will publish their own forms of secondary sources. So just as this particular law school, Boston College, publishes 4 different law reviews and also produces the UCC Reporter Digest. So those are all secondary sources. And we mentioned the major types. Let's go in and take a quick look at what they cover. So legal encyclopedias, there are 2 major ones. One is American Jurisprudence Second, and the other is Corpus Juris Secundum, or a body of law second. These are like any encyclopedia you used in your academic career. They will cover topics alphabetically by subject, and if you're not sure how to start with your subject search, there is an index that covers the whole set. There will be footnotes to reference relevant cases once you've found your topic. We would use a legal encyclopedia really to get a broad overview of a specific topic. They're rarely cited by courts as persuasive authority. And where would we find them? You can find them in print here in the Boston College Law Library. You can find Lexis covers the American Jurisprudence Encyclopedia. Westlaw will cover both American Jurisprudence and Corpus Juris Secundum. In addition, there are specialized state-specific encyclopedias, for example, Ohio Jurisprudence Third, and we'll show you in the second video how to find those. One way to do so would be to search in the Boston College Law Library's catalog, and it will tell you which vendor covers which encyclopedia. So we mentioned that we use encyclopedias just to get started in a certain area of law. It helps us gather those relevant sites, helps us find out what the leading cases or applicable statutes are. It can also be very helpful if you're not immediately understanding whether federal or state law controls in a particular area, for example, in bankruptcy. So a quick way to check authority. Here's an example of Corpus Juris Secundum, and we're looking at a little segment from their right of privacy annotation. So we see that it's a basic statement, gives us lots of references to statutes and cases. American law reports are long essays, we call them annotations, that synopsize various cases. They tend to focus on very narrow legal topics. It's still useful because it will help address issues and controversy. So things like splits between jurisdictions. So it could be a split between circuits on the federal level, or a split between how federal and state governments are treating a particular topic. ALR is a large multi-volume set. If you're looking at it in print, it would be many shelves, and it has a multiple index. Why multiple index? Because there's both a federal series and an international series. The national state series will cover obviously both areas. What are the features of the annotations? Well, it will give you a table of contents, a detailed subject index, and what many students really like about ALR is it gives you something called a table of jurisdictions. And what that will do is it will set out for you whether or not certain states have controlling case or statutory law on that particular topic. Where can we find it? We can find it in print in the Boston College Law Library. It's also available on the Lexis and Westlaw platforms. When would you use ALR? Really when you're looking for more detailed coverage of a narrow legal issue, so it's less helpful for that broad overview. Let's look at an example. Here's a sample ALR annotation, and it's dealing with issues of admissibility and the effects of evidence rules, rules of professional ethics in this instance, in legal malpractice actions. So it will start off, it tells us the author, this would be an editor employed by the company, and then it gives us a little synopsis or syllabus, little abstract of what the particular annotation will cover. If we looked at more of it, we would see references to certain state bar professional ethics or from the ABA. Treatises. Treatises are written by experts in the field. They tend to be much more scholarly content. They're heavily footnoted. In format, you'll find them in print and electronic format on multiple platforms. They can be either single volumes or multi-volume sets. And you see two examples here. One is a treatise on constitutional law, and one is Newberg on class actions. So when would you decide to start with a treatise? Really, they're more helpful when you need an in-depth treatment of an area of law. So you're going to get many, many case references and references to statutes and to other secondary sources when you're using a treatise. Also, if you're looking for a persuasive authority, very well-respected treatises may be cited by courts, although again, they are only persuasive. And finally, there are some jurisdiction-specific sources. So you may find that you have a particular issue about divorce law in Massachusetts. In that case, the Massachusetts Practice Series would be very helpful to you. It's obviously devoted to this particular jurisdiction. It's written by experts who practice in this particular jurisdiction, and it will be a nice marriage between the very heavily scholarly approach and a legal encyclopedia, in that it will give you references to the key cases and statutes, but it will also give you practice tips. Here we're looking at a California criminal law set that's in multiple volumes. The coverage for state by states will vary greatly, so smaller states or states with a smaller bar will have fewer sources. One of the ways to uncover these is, again, to search the Boston College Law Library's Holmes catalog. That would tell you what Boston College owns. It also will index what's available on Lexis, Westlaw, and Bloomberg Law for treatise content. Let's think now about continuing legal education and practice guides. So once you're a member of the practicing bar, you will generally, in most jurisdictions, have a responsibility to fulfill certain numbers of CLE credits each year. States and specific practice groups publish these CLE materials. So in our state, Massachusetts, we have the Massachusetts Continuing Legal Education Group. They're a nonprofit group. They have a very powerful electronic resource that BC Law subscribes to called the MCLE Online Pass. It contains not only copies of their printed practice guides, but also videos of their training sessions. So if you want to go in and watch a video from a presentation on a particular new issue in the area of bankruptcy, you can do that. These are really practice guides, so they're practical, they're practitioner oriented. One of the big sources we recommend to you is something called PLI, or Practicing Law Institute's Discover Plus electronic platform that covers their handbooks, their course materials, and transcripts of PLI training sessions. PLI is an excellent source. They hire the most well-known practitioners in certain areas, for example, securities law, and they put on their programs both as live sessions and as remote or distance learning opportunities to attend a single session, whether electronically by a distance learning method or in person usually costs about $1,200. Because we subscribe to the source, though, you're able to go in and search and uncover that material and use it without fee. So when would you use these materials? Really, when you need guidance on more practice-related questions, I think of it as the how-to kinds of questions. How would you actually file an electronic proxy? And that's the end of our introduction to secondary sources.